Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of contributing.today. We are so excited to be coming to you live today, and this edition is going to be a little gem-packed with Ruby. Thank you so much for joining. A couple of notes before we get started. We've got our code of conduct, which you'll see linked shortly. Recordings of past sessions. By attending this meetup, you will, of course, be agreeing to abide by this code of conduct. You will find recordings of past sessions and interviews as well on this website. Please join our discussion through Discord. Our link is available on the website. Come on over, ask us questions. We are eager to hear from you. Our hashtag, if you'd like to post about us, is #contributing.today.
Yay, thank you, Ramon. And welcome everyone on this very, very, very special Wednesday, because today is Ramon's birthday. Yeah, I'm sorry, Ramon. I kind of have to do this. I blame Floor, by the way, because she made me do it. And if I'm gonna scare the audience, Ramon, just talk to Floor. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ramon. Happy birthday to you.
That was wonderful. I have to try so hard not to cry right now. Thank you all. Bad? No, I meant cry from joy.
Oh, okay. Phew. Well, okay, yeah. Well, I'm sorry. You had to go through this. I hope the audience is still there on our Ruby open source Ruby edition. We also have an Amsterdam Ruby meetup in case you're interested in more Ruby stuff. You can visit the link right here. And we have our next meetup virtual meetup, of course, scheduled on Tuesday, April the 20th. So feel free to join us there.
I'll be marking that on my calendar. Well, let's get into what we're going to talk about today. We've got 3 very special guests that we'll be having on shortly to talk about, first off, a panel. We're going to have a panel discussion on using Ruby in production now. After that, Sophia, who's already joined, hello, will be joining us to talk about using Vagrant and Ruby at HashiCorp.
Yes, so one of our first panelists I'd like to introduce is Eileen. Eileen is a principal engineer at GitHub, part of the Rails core team, and a serial conference speaker.
Next up, we've got Jorik from Git, who is a senior backend engineer at GitLab since quite a while, from my understanding, based in the Netherlands. And I've seen a lot of pictures that he's been posting of the stars. So those are quite pretty. Welcome.
And our final guest is Sophia, a software engineer at HashiCorp, previously worked at Anaconda Inc., Moo, and Hootsuite.
Well, once again, let me take the opportunity to say on behalf of everybody, thank the 3 of you so much for coming on today. We are so eager to hear about how Ruby is being used in production at your respective workplaces. And I would like to kick off this discussion by asking a question you've probably been asked before, but probably on a lot of folks' minds. Quick reminder, if you've got any questions, do please feel free to post these on Discord. So the question is, how's Ruby 3 treating you? Feel free to go ahead and start chatting with us.
So Jorik, Eileen, how is Ruby 3 treating you?
We're not on Ruby 3 yet. Also, I've decided that I am retired from doing upgrades, so I'm not personally doing this upgrade. But we have our build screen, so we're close to production testing, but we haven't gotten there yet. So I can't say it's treating us yet, but we should be there soon.
Yeah, I think at GitLab we're the same. I believe we only quite recently upgraded to Ruby 2.7. And I think compared to 2.6. I think we upgraded before 2.5. It wasn't too hard, but it just took a couple of months just to plan it in. I think Ruby 3 is probably going to be a bit more effort. I suspect GitLab in itself will probably work fine, but probably some of our dependencies may need some changes. And I think there were some deprecations in 2.7 that have now, whatever was deprecated has been removed. So I don't see us moving to Ruby 3, that's probably the next 3 to 6 months.
We're in the same kind of boat where it's not really treating us yet. We haven't gotten there.
It's really interesting to see that it's quite consistent there.
So, Sophia, what advice would you give to beginners who want to start contributing to open source but don't really know where to start or how to start? Can you give some advice or tips, maybe like beginner friendly? How do they start?
Yeah, that's kind of a hard question, I think, for me.
How did you start then, for instance?
I guess I just started because I was interested in some project that I found on GitHub, and then I just kind of kept putting stuff in that project until someone would look at it, which is maybe not the nicest thing, being on the other side of that now. But being consistent and trying to like engage in the community, eventually someone will like engage back with you.
Yeah, kind of. Because sometimes it can be quite daunting as a beginner to contribute to an open source project, and it's like, well, is it? Am I doing it right? Isn't my code shitty? Is it like? It's quite scary. So we're pretty curious. Like maybe Yorick, you have any tips for beginners who want to start contributing to open source projects?
Oh boy. I mean, for me, it's been a while since I started. Yeah, I think my experience is quite different, I think, from most people, because I kind of sort of roll into it. Like I started at a fairly young age, but I didn't really start doing it like professionally until about, I think, 11 years ago at this point. It's difficult to sort of give blanket advice. I think the sort of most important bit to remember there is that when you're starting out, it can feel like whatever you're doing is just, bad, and why are you doing it, that sort of thing. And I think it's important to remember that basically everybody you talk to was at that stage at some point, and that you start with something that perhaps isn't so good, but that's sort of how you build things up.
Yeah, thank you. I see we had we have some questions for our previous on our previous subject, like Ruby 3, which is what are all the, I think it's from Discord, what are all the parts involved in upgrading? So if you'd like to upgrade to Ruby 3, like apart from the code updates, what are all the parts involved in upgrading? Who wants to take this? Yes, Eileen?
I keep muting myself. So I think that this is a really interesting point, because like York mentioned that they have to fix deprecated code. So like one of the ways that GitHub makes upgrading easier is we refuse to run with deprecations in our code base. So like we actually did all the work for the deprecations in 2.7, specifically so that we could avoid it being like just totally broken. We also do that for Rails. We run completely deprecation free. And that also helps us like not have to play whack-a-mole with like other changes that are going into GitHub. Like someone does a feature and then they don't know that like Rails deprecated whatever, and then they add a bunch of it, then it would fall on the team upgrading to then fix it. So if we can prevent that from even entering the code base in the first place, then we don't have to like play this whack-a-mole game with other teams. But then like once you get past that, like parts of upgrading, it's like once you get the build green, then you should test locally, make sure that like development works, and make sure all your other builds work, because we only run one build on 3.0 right now. And then when we flip the gem files over, it's like all the other builds are failing. And then we roll out to what's called Review Lab. It's just our like staging server. Test there for a while. Then we roll out to lab, which is like it doesn't, because review lab expires in a few hours, so we can't use that for like full company testing. If it's a really major upgrade, we'll ask teams to click test their area of the code base just to get like a regular usage for a hot second. And then we roll out to Canary. Our Canary is 2%, 20%, and then 100%. But we actually, in upgrades like this, we'll roll out to specific servers to make sure that like the Git hosts work before we get everything out. So our major upgrades are a bit more complicated with Ruby than they are with Rails, because we don't do that part with Rails. Yeah. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Totally.
We have another question from the audience. So, are you using Ruby for specific projects - apps in your company? And what are the criteria to decide to use Ruby or other tech? And what other tech are you using? So, who wants to take this one?
I can start, I guess. We can all do
sure.
it.
You want me to repeat the question?
Sorry?
You want me to repeat the question?
No. I got it. Yeah. So GitLab, the sort of project as a whole, is divided in a couple of different software projects. So there's the sort of main web interface. That one is written in Ruby on Rails, and then we have some sort of side components. Most are written in Ruby. Some newer ones are being written in Go. For example, we have a service called Gitly, which basically fetches data from a Git repository and sort of exposes an API to that data. The underlying idea there is that the Rails application doesn't need direct storage access to the Git repositories. And that service is written in Go. Typically, we default to using Ruby unless there's a good reason for using something else. So this service, for example, it's being used a lot, like GitLab being a Git, or at least part of it being a sort of Git visualization program and a program to work with Git. It means it's doing a lot of Git operations. And in particular, it needs support for parallelism. Now, you can do that in Ruby with JRuby, for example. I don't remember exactly if we ever considered JRuby for this, but excuse me, we opted to go with Go for this particular service and some similar ones, basically. Besides that, we're not really using any other language. You know, there's some stuff written in shell scripts here and there, but we don't have projects in, I don't know, Elixir or Rust or whatever.
Thank you. Sorry, would anybody else like to jump on that one?
I can, for GitHub. So our main application is Rails and has been since, I don't know, when did GitHub get started? Like 2007 or 6 or something? I don't know. Long time ago, long before my time. Probably before I started using Rails. No, that's not true. Around the time I started using Rails. So that's like not a choice that would change at this point. I mean, we actually have new apps being built in Rails too. And those just really like, if you're interacting with a database and like a web front end or an API and stuff, like you don't, like Go is not going to be fun to use for that. Rails just works when it comes to database setup and stuff. So in those cases, we choose Rails. We have some Go services, like when you upload your avatars, that goes to a Go service. I think we have some Java stuff, but I can't even like name something that's written in Java. I think it's more for like some of the enterprise services. And it's really just like, what is the right tool for the thing that you're building? And we try not to like we can experiment with other languages, but we try not to just like build services that only one person like knows that language, and then there's no one to take care of it, because like that's how you end up with a bunch of stuff that breaks like in 5 years, and nobody knew it existed until you get a tweet about it. So we try not to do that stuff. We did this whole paved paths thing where we, made sure that certain documents were, certain languages were like well documented and how to use them and like what to not do. So, like while Sinatra is like perfectly good for an API, we usually don't recommend it, because if you're going to mix Rails into Sinatra, you should just use Rails. And so since that almost always happens at GitHub, which is actually a funny story, most people probably don't even know this, the REST API at GitHub is Sinatra. It lives inside the Rails app. I wouldn't do that in the future, but this was like, GitHub's super old, so it was before Rails had its own API, and so I was like, oh, let's just build a Sinatra app inside of it. But yep.
Thanks. Sorry, Sophia. Did you?
Sure. Yeah, I can address this also. So Vagrant is a pretty mature project. It's been around for like probably more than 10 years now. So we kind of just like inherited using Ruby there. But whenever we're building new stuff for Vagrant, we'll probably use like we use Ruby or we use Go. HashiCorp has a lot of like Go projects already. So if we're like ever building a utility on our team, we might just go ahead and build it with that, just because we already have the tools available to us to make that process really fast. But those are kind of our two things that we go for.
That's awesome. Thank you. I've got another question from the audience. And the question is, what is it about Ruby that makes you want to stick with it, that you like, and that makes you want to stick with the community, that sort of thing?
I'll go first. Unless someone else wants to go first. So Ruby is the first language that I really felt like I wanted to understand how it worked. With PHP, you're like, yes, great, I just wrote some WordPress, awesome. And it didn't feel like I think there's much more of a community now, but when I was doing WordPress stuff, it was like there's the WordPress community, and it didn't feel a lot like there was like a PHP community the same way Ruby has one. And like Ruby people were just nice and wanted more people to work on Ruby. And I also think that it's just really enjoyable to write. Like when I've tried other languages, I just get frustrated that it's like, why don't you have a good ORM like active record? Or, I mean, that's not Ruby, that's Rails. Well, Ruby, Rails, whatever. It's all the same thing. And that's the other part of it. Like, I like that we have this framework that's just like, just works. I know I'm a little biased because I am on the core team for Rails, but it's like the language and framework actually care about your experience. Like even if you don't like agree with, I don't think it should do this, but the goal of like the language and framework is what is your experience and like, can we make it better for you? Where I don't feel like that many other languages actually give a shit about what it's like to write it. It really doesn't care about your experience. So I think that's my favorite part about Ruby, is that I feel like Ruby cares about my experience. Which is why I don't like the Quarks changes. It doesn't feel very caring of my experience, but here we are.
Yeah, I would say for me it's very similar. Like Ruby overall is a very mature language, both in terms of the language itself, but also the libraries that are there, the community, the meetups. And of course, you have this in other languages, Python probably being the most familiar other example of that. But then if you start looking at other languages, it sort of very quickly it tapers off, I think is the right word. Like you have, say, number 3, 4, and then there's like a lot of projects where it's kind of all over the place. I will say, like, at least for me in recent years, I've been using Ruby a little less in my spare time, but that's largely based on what I work on in my spare time. But I think if I were to say build some sort of company today, and I would have to pick a programming language for it, assuming that it's some sort of web-based service and not say an embedded software project, it would probably be Ruby. Like it has basically everything you need, whether it's an ORM or authentication library or you name it. There's probably at least 2 or 3 gems for it. But there's also a lot of resources on it. There's a lot of people working with it. So if you want to hire somebody, chances are you won't have really trouble finding people. And so overall, it's, in spite of some people for years liking to claim, hey, it's dying and this and that, it is still, I think, for a lot of projects, at least one of the right choices you can make, because there's other languages that could be equally successful, say Python. But I would say for most people, you basically can't go wrong with using Ruby.
Yeah, thank you, Yorick. And Sophia?
Yeah, I just started programming Ruby when I joined HashiCorp about a year ago. So I don't really consider myself like a big Ruby person. I come from like more the Python side. But this year has been like really awesome. Yeah, using Ruby is super neat. I like its flexibility. And one thing that I really like to be able to do is just like look at my editor and just like understand what's going on right away, like just at a glance. And yeah, the developer experience is really awesome. So I've really been enjoying it.
Yeah, nice. Thank you.
That is fantastic to hear. I've got a follow-up question, if I may. All 3 of you have mentioned like having these positive experiences with Ruby. I'm curious, can you share any memories of like really, really positive Ruby learning moments that really unlocked something in terms of understanding, say, in computing or something like that, or how the web works, that Ruby really attached itself to? I'm curious, do you have any stories regarding that?
I think, at least for me, the trouble here is I've probably had so many I don't remember them. and I personally have a tendency to remember like the bad experiences better than the good ones. Yeah, I can't think of any like specific ones where it's like, oh, I did this in Ruby and now it made everything more clear. I do remember when I was first trying to learn it. I was also coming from a PHP background. And I think it took me a couple of months of trying to learn Ruby and somehow just not either getting it or just not sort of pushing far enough. It's been a while, I don't remember the specifics. But then I think at some point it clicked, and that's sort of where you could basically almost see sort of the snowball rolling downhill, because you're like, okay, here we go. Now it's fun time, basically.
So what is your favorite Ruby open source project or gem, Yorick?
I mean, I would say in sort of practical terms, probably Rails. There's a lot of parts I would disagree with, but in terms of what it offers to do and what it has enabled many people to do, I think there's basically no doubt. It's probably the number 1. The number 2 for me will be a library called SQL, not SQL, but SEQUEL, made by Jeremy Evans. It's a database library / toolkit with an ORM. And I haven't used it for the last couple of years, unfortunately. But when I did use it, it was probably one of the best database libraries that I've ever worked with. Like, it supported everything you could possibly think of in a really nice way.
How about you, Sophia? What are your favorite Ruby open source projects or gems?
Oh, I guess I'm going to be really basic, but I really love using Pry Bybug.
Oh my God, you just made Ramon's day.
It's like so great to like how you can just like cruise around in it. I mean, obviously there are other languages have similar things, but yeah, Pry is just like really awesome. And I just enjoy using it too.
Yeah, so does Ramon.
we were chatting about this earlier today, and like Right and I were asking like what's your favorite one, and I was like, yeah, probably Pride, because it just like it saved my butt 1,000 times.
Right? Yeah.
It made me enjoy, like it finally made breakpoints click for me.
Mhm. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I definitely like all that. It's so good.
And how about you, Eileen? What's your favorite open source gem project?
It's Rails. But like specifically Active Record. I just like don't think a lot of other. I think that it's like really easy to not appreciate how much Active Record does for you. Like all the complexity that it's just like you don't have to worry about. I mean, you should still worry about it, but like, I'll just like never forget the time that when I first had to write some GraphQL in our GitHub app, and like what like you call user.star, and then like you have to like write the mutation for GraphQL, and it's like 17 lines long, and I was just like, nope. Love Active Record. One line. I know what it does. I don't have to like learn. I don't have to like learn all these new words. Like just user.star. It's like English. You can just read what it's doing. And I just appreciate so much about how Active Record makes that stuff less painful. But of course, I'm biased because I've worked mostly on Active Record. And I've probably added more features to Active Record than I have to any other. Now, that's definitely true. I don't really touch the other gems much. But yeah, so Active Record.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's stick to this topic of open source. I hope it's safe to assume that you've all been doing a lot of open source in your spare time or as your jobs. One thing that I definitely struggle with is knowing like what's good enough of my silly side projects to put up on GitHub and sort of expose to the world. What would you say to like yourself maybe a handful of years ago? What is good enough?
Well, I always say there's not enough ridiculousness in the world. So like if you have ridiculous stuff, just put it on GitHub. Like what? Someone be like, this code isn't perfect, but it brought me lots of joy. Like who's gonna say that? You should just, I mean, maybe somebody will, but you should just ban that person and like let everyone else just tell you how awesome your like cat generator is or whatever. And I mean, in those cases, I like probably wouldn't be like, hey, use this gem in your app unless you need to generate cats. But I don't think there's anything that's like not worth putting on GitHub. I put a lot of weird stuff. I don't know if it's that weird, but I like put like every demo app that I make on GitHub. I mean, it's easier for me to say that because like I work at GitHub, so we get free repos. But that was like the motivation for me before I worked at GitHub was like, oh, I want to put this on GitHub, but like I don't want anyone to see it yet. And so you make it a little better and then you open source it. Because then if it's public, you don't have to pay for the repos. But I mean, like I just think that you should put anything on there. If it's not production ready, just label it as such. I don't really have to, unless like you end up on Hacker News or Reddit, you're probably not going to get anyone like getting weird in your comments. Hopefully, and if you do, if like anyone's ever harassing you on GitHub, like tell GitHub support, and they'll just get like they'll take care of it.
Yeah, I agree there. I would say like probably default to putting it in public. Obviously, if it has private info in it, maybe not. Like I have some scripts related to financing that make some assumptions about the name of my bank account, for example, and the names of some companies so it can categorize it. That I wouldn't put on GitHub because I don't need people to know where I buy my groceries. But in terms of silly things, like years ago, I made a sort of like a static site generator for pictures from my cat at the time. And it would basically sort of sync it, crop them automatically and that sort of thing. And I don't think anybody ever saw it, but I put it on GitHub at the time because why not? I have a Git repo there. It's free, so why not put it there? Basically, I think there for beginners it can perhaps be a bit scary because they might think what if somebody comes in and starts criticizing me? It does happen, but at least from what I know, that's generally when the project is sort of shared somewhere. Like let's say shared on Reddit and it does something silly. Inevitably, you'll get a lot of people going like, "No, actually, you should have written it this way. You should have used that language." I would say probably the best response to this is just ignore it. Like GitHub at least has various facilities that you can lock the project, you can block people, etc. GitLab has some work to do in that area, unfortunately. So in practice, I wouldn't worry too much about that.
So, as a maintainer, if you're running a project, what's the best way to turn down an otherwise great PR that doesn't fit? Like, how do you say no in a sweet, nice, gentle way without scaring off the developer who actually wrote the PR? Eileen?
That one's kind of hard because Rails is super opinionated. So it can make it easier to know what should go in because you're like, well, it doesn't go with Rails opinions. So usually in those cases, it's documented. So we can say like, hey, no, we don't. Or like, we'll get a lot of what we call cosmetic PRs where somebody just reorganizes the code or uses a different method that's exactly the same or something, and we'll reject it based on it being cosmetic, which is also documented. Or if it's like a performance fix, but it's too much of a micro performance fix, like we consider that cosmetic because if it doesn't have an impact, like there's no point in like doing code churn or worse, making it harder to read just to like shave a microsecond off of the build that never even actually affects production. So for like, but then if it's just a feature that's like doesn't have documentation that we can't say like, hey, sorry, like we don't do this. Usually we try to like explain why it's not a feature that Rails wants. Sometimes it's just like, this is like really complex and we just don't want to add that, or I don't know, I can't think of one, or, oh, this isn't the right fix. In some cases, we'll take someone's PR and then fix it. If there's been like a lot of back and forth and we just like don't want to have to keep making the contributor go back and forth, we'll take the PR down, like clone it down and then fix it and then push it up with their authorship on it. So they still get the credit, but we don't have to like keep going back and forth because it gets old after a while. And like, if you ask them for something and they do it, then you don't see it. And then there's a merge conflict and you're like, do I ask them to go back and fix it again? That seems kind of annoying for them. So sometimes we'll do that. And it really depends on the situation. Like we try to like at least say, thank you, but we don't want this feature. Please come back again with something else. Or if it's someone who keeps opening PRs that we keep closing, like so sometimes we'll get, 5 or 6 PRs from the same person who's new, and a lot of their changes are cosmetic, or they're changing all the favors to favor spelled the UK or like Canadian way with the U and it. And we'll be like, no, let me like try to have a conversation with them. And sometimes like if it's really bad, we'll like reach out to the contributor directly and say like, or sometimes we'll see someone like commenting on all the PRs, telling people what to change. And then we'll have to like reach out to them and say like, dude, maybe chill out a little bit because like you're giving them the wrong advice, and then they're going to get frustrated that we're asking them to do something else. And it's my number one GitHub pet peeve is that it is not clear who is a project maintainer and who is just someone from the community. And it can make it very difficult. I realize I work at GitHub and I'm saying that, but everyone knows this is my pet peeve. I say it all the time at work too. Just like, if you can't tell like who is a maintainer and who's random person who stopped by to give you advice on your pull request, you're going to get frustrated that two people are telling you something different when you don't realize they have different levels of expertise and power in that case. I don't know if that answered the question, but that answered a question that maybe somebody had.
Thank you. Sorry, would any of you two like to also have a go at it?
Yeah, I can add some. So, for example, the context of GitLab, we generally have fairly extensive documentation, like both in our sort of public handbook, although that's more company oriented, and our documentation for developers. Sometimes it does reach a bit of a point where there's so much you don't know where to start. It's a bit of a running joke sometimes that at least the handbook is sort of a black hole. Like information goes in, but there's so much it can be difficult to get it back out. But we specifically have a team that deals with community contributions, interactions. I forgot what we exactly called the team. But they, for example, engaged when you have somebody contributing and they are doing these sort of drive-by comments where they go through like 20 patches and comment all sorts of things that are perhaps unnecessary, unpleasant, whatever. And then that team might engage them either in the issue or perhaps through email saying like, hey, what's going on, or we had some complaints, that sort of thing. For personal project, I think it's a bit more difficult because generally you are the only one, or maybe one or two other people working on it. I think for many people, there's the biggest hurdle is that they simply are afraid to say no, because they might think, oh, perhaps they will interpret this too negatively, or perhaps I'll scare them off in some way. And I definitely wouldn't recommend people just write no and then add the label won't fix, for example. But you can explain like, hey, we're trying to achieve this goal, or here's a document that explains it. As Eileen said, generally the best way is have sort of written out what you are looking for. And then you can just link to that, say, hey, this is the kind of changes we want. Here's a couple of examples of changes that we're not looking for. Please let me know. In other words, have an actual conversation with the people instead of sort of slamming the door shut right away.
Thank you, Yorick.
Sorry, Sophia. Did you want to answer as well?
Yeah, I can add something to the end of that. I'd like to echo what Yorick said. I mean, it always sucks when the right thing for you as a maintainer to do is to reject a pull request, especially when you have a community member who's even excited enough about your project to spend the time to work on something and submit it to you. But having that conversation about like why this isn't the right thing for the project at this point, and the direction that you want to go in, I think is like the nicest way to just say that this isn't the right thing for right now. But we still appreciate this kind of contribution and appreciate that contributor, because as maintainers, I think that's something that really excites us when the community engages back with us.
Yeah, so Sophie, about that, what role do you play, or do your respective your company HashiCorp play in the community?
So we have a couple of different, or a few different open source projects that are maintained by us. And I guess we maintain them and contribute to them, and we have users give us questions and feedback onto what features they want, and that's kind of where we lie in contributing back to the community. on the Go side, there's tons of Go packages that HashiCorp maintains that aren't just used by internal HashiCorp engineering, but also other teams, different companies. So that's kind of where we lie.
Thank you, Sophia. So Yorick, how about you? What role do you play in the community and GitLab? In the
Yeah, so nowadays my role, at least in GitLab specifically, is a bit more sort of backstage oriented. So for the first couple of years, I was doing a lot of performance optimizations, and that was fairly community facing, because I was one of the few, when I started, the only one doing it. So I was the one going through all the issues, dealing with everything basically. And nowadays I'm more focused on all the release tooling, processes, etc. So it's a bit more backstage related, but occasionally and lately a bit more often we take functionality that we've built ourselves and then put that in GitLab, and through that process you interact more with the community. But that's more this process of, hey, we're considering building this, what are the things you would perhaps be looking for, or you basically ask specifically for feedback. So my role there is a little less, I would say, that of a sort of classical maintainer that goes through all the issues, triages them, etc. The way we have that set up, it's generally divided across teams. So teams have sort of specific topics, basically, they work on. And that's sort of what they triage. We also have a lot of automation there because we have a ridiculous amount of open issues. I think it's something in the order of like 15,000 currently. It's just impossible to triage that all by hand.
Excellent. Thank you. So we are coming up to the end of our time for this panel. So I would like to ask one more, a parting question, if I may. So seeing as how things are coming up, I would love to hear from you, from all three of you. What would you like to see more of in Ruby or the Ruby community itself? And what is your wishes for Ruby? What are your wishes? I can English for Ruby in the upcoming year. Maybe Sophia, since sorry.
All right, I was just going to I would say for me that would be better language server integration. So there is Solar Graph, I believe it's called, but Ruby as a language itself just makes this rather difficult due to how dynamic it is. And I would like to see the Ruby core devs focus on that to some degree, not just like, for example, they added type hinting in Ruby 2.7 and then sort of made it official 3.0, I believe. But I think they would have to take it a bit further and actually start building the sort of language server tools, processes, etc. for it. Because I believe that, especially for large projects like GitLab, GitHub, etc., I think they would be incredibly helpful for the development process.
Thank you. Feel free to hop in if you wanted to follow up.
I want to see more companies actively contributing to Rails and Ruby. I don't see a lot of newcomers, and a lot of times when I talk to people, they're like, I found this bug, and I'm like, okay, let's fix it. I'm like, well, my company doesn't give me time to. And so that's very frustrating because these companies are making millions of dollars off of Rails and Ruby and won't. And this isn't every company, but I hear it a lot. They're like, well, it's just not part of our bottom line, or they won't upgrade, and upgrading gets you closer to contributing. You can't contribute to Rails and Ruby if you're on an old version, right? Because no one cares if you have a 7-year-old bug. It's upgrade and the bug is fixed. We're not going to fix the Rails 3.2 because you've got a bug in it. So first, like, I want to see everyone upgrade and like upgrade often, you know, like sometimes companies are like, oh, well, you know, I'll just like wait until like 5.2 is going to be, well, I think it's EOL now. Maybe it's not, I can't remember. Let's EOL 5.2 and then we'll upgrade. And I said, well, that's like the wrong way to do it. Like GitHub, we're like running off of Rails main. Like we can do it. And I don't think that everybody should run off Rails main. Like if you don't know what's coming into the release like each week, that's fine. But like waiting 6 years to upgrade is like bad for you. And it's not just bad for it's bad for the community. And ultimately it's going to be bad for your bottom line. And this is true of any language that you're not upgrading. The longer you wait, the like more that foundation of your application crumbles. So I want to see companies upgrading, and then I want to see them contributing. If you find a bug in Ruby 3, like at least open an issue. There's, you know, we found that Stackprof was seg faulting, so we fixed this Stackprof seg fault. There was something else with the caller locations that we found, but like we didn't know how to fix it, so we just opened an issue and it got fixed within like 24 hours. And so maintainers can't fix stuff they don't know about. Just because GitHub is running on Rails main doesn't mean we have the same bugs that Basecamp has when they run off main or Shopify has when they run off main. So it's really, really important that we, that the companies that are using Rails and Ruby aren't just like passive users. I want to see more who will be active users of them.
I want to quickly jump into that, Eileen. Like, what do you think that there are not a lot of newcomers into the community?
Because I'm on the Rails issue tracker every day, and I see like new people reporting issues, but I don't see like a lot of new engagement. I'm not saying there's no new people, but it does feel a little bit like I don't see a lot of quality contributions. Like what I was talking about before, the cosmetic changes, I see a lot of those, but they're not the changes that we need. And I just don't, we have a few new people, but it was like, it feels like I know there are lots of new people using Rails and Ruby, right? But I don't feel like that's trickling into the open source side as much as I would hope and expect. And I think that part of it is fear of upgrading and companies not giving people time to contribute to Rails and Ruby.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. What you reckon we could do as a community or something to improve on that?
I don't think it's like I said, I don't think it's really like there's something. I do think that Rails could do a better job of like onboarding people. It's a really, really hard framework. And like sometimes people will be like, oh, why don't you label the good first issues? And it's like, because we don't know which ones they are until we've spent an hour on them. And then it's like, if I spent an hour on it, I probably know the answer. So it's like hard to be like, well, I'm not going to fix it and label it good first issue. That's seems like not great for the rest of the community who's like using that version and like, where's the fix? So it's sort of like a chicken and egg situation in that case. But I think that like, if companies gave people more time to contribute, then that would improve. I think it's a group effort, and that like we could do everything, but if companies won't let people contribute, then it doesn't matter. It's like, I don't think that we should like all be working on open source in our free time. Like I don't work on open source in my free time anymore. I used to spend like nights and weekends on it. And like now that GitHub lets me or wants me to make Rails better for GitHub, I don't do that on my nights and weekends because it's like working for free overtime. But like it's hard to get into open source without doing that first. And that's why I want companies to like give people the time. And I don't mean like a sad Friday every 3 months. I mean like, say if you find a bug, you can fix it. Don't like, because you're not going to find a bug on a Friday that is like your 5 minutes to like work on Rails open source. Like you find the bug when you're upgrading and then you go fix it. And like, that's the difference. It's like, you have to be involved in the entire life cycle of your application, including the foundation. And if you're not, like, and it's just an app,
Yeah, I think there are a lot of companies that have this sort of idea that the software we care about is the software we ship. Everything else that sort of magically comes to life and works, and we don't care about that. So I think, sort of in general, what projects could do is they sort of could highlight, for example, contributions more. Like in GitLab, we have in the monthly post, we have this whole section dedicated to the MVP, like the best contribution that month, for example. We highlight occasionally more than one, and projects could do that. But I think a significant portion of that is indeed companies sort of having to change their culture from, and this sounds perhaps a bit negative, but from like purely consuming open source to also producing it, and by producing not just producing their own things, but pushing things back into the projects that they use. But I think that's a very difficult change to make. Certainly going to take a lot of very small steps to get there.
Cool. Thank you. Unless there's anything to add there, Sophia, any parting wishes or something to add about the Ruby community?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I'm pretty new to the Ruby community, so I don't really have anything that I feel like I really want to see from it, other than maybe have expectations for myself to participate in it more, and perhaps take some of Eileen's advice and really dig into. I mean, I'm not really a big consumer of Rails, but I mean Ruby and Gem and Bundler, which are all like important pieces of infrastructure in this community. We can definitely like take more time to be cognizant of like how I'm using it and how I can contribute to those communities.
Cool.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Maita.
Well, thank you, all of you. I think our time is almost up, so we have still like a couple of seconds, minutes maybe. But are there any upcoming events or any other cool Ruby events we should not miss besides Amsterdam Ruby on the 20th of April?
Of course, RailsConf.
Oh, yeah.
I'm keynoting, so I have to say everyone should come to RailsConf.
Oh, awesome!
You should all come to RailsConf.
And do we know any speakers? No, that's not okay. Well, what's
I'm
that?
speaking at RailsConf too.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my god! Awesome! Amazing! Cool. Well, cannot be missed. Do we don't have a date just yet? Do we? Rail? Is it right? We probably do. When is it?
Mid-April, I think. 14th to
The 12th.
16th.
The 12th to the 15th.
Okay. So we have Eileen,
4 days.
And we have Ramon as one of the speakers. Oh my god, I have to. I cannot miss this. Okay. Oh, there you go. April 12, 15. Awesome. So again, thank you very, very much for your time. And I also I learned a lot today. So thank you, Yorick. Thank you, Eileen. And thank you, Sophia. And I think it's time to move on to the second part of our session. Right, Ramon?
That is absolutely correct, Maita. So next up, we've got Sophia coming up once again to tell us about Ruby at HashiCorp and about how the Vagrant project is using it too. So welcome back, Sophia. Long time no see.
Hey.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing us a little bit more about how HashiCorp is using Ruby and about the Vagrant project.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Yes. And if anyone has any questions, please post them in the chat, Discord. We'll make sure to ask them.
All right. So today can everyone see my screen now? I think so. So today I want to talk a little bit about Ruby and Vagrant at HashiCorp. So more specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about building Vagrant, so our build process, and how we use Vagrant to actually make that process easy. So I'm Sophia. I work at HashiCorp on Vagrant. I'm a software engineer, and I've been floating around open source for the last few years. I've been working in Python a bit, and more recently doing lots of Ruby here on Vagrant. So you might find me floating around on GitHub at Soapy1. You can come hit me up if you're around. So you might be familiar with other HashiCorp products if you're not super familiar with Vagrant. So we build stuff like Terraform and Packer and Vault and Nomad in Console, and more recently Waypoint and Boundary. So these are all pretty famously Go applications, but we have lots of love for Ruby at HashiCorp as well. So Vagrant is actually a Ruby application. And we have some web offerings, so like Vagrant Cloud and Terraform Enterprise, which are written in Ruby. So today, I'm going to look a little bit at how we build Vagrant. So our roadmap is we're going to talk a little bit about Vagrant for people who are unfamiliar with it. Some of the challenges that are associated with building this desktop application for a bit like using Ruby, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Vagrant concepts that we need in order to understand how our build system works, and then we're going to go ahead and actually build some installers. So Vagrant, it's a application that you run on your desktop written in Ruby, and the goal here is to allow users to manage their virtual machines with ease. So say you are a developer, you're running on Mac or Linux or something, and you want to have a Windows machine for testing. Maybe you want to be able to share this machine with some of your coworkers, or you want to have some like configuration associated with it. Then maybe Vagrant can help you out for like managing this machine. Or say you want to have some like build environments that you want to manage very easily with like a CLI. Again, Vagrant can like help you out there maybe. So now that we have kind of an understanding of what Vagrant is, let's go ahead and do some packaging. So we thought that this was maybe going to be a boring talk about packaging. Don't fret, this is going to be an exciting talk about packaging. So all of our packages, our packaging infrastructure is actually like our code is up on GitHub. You can check it out at hashicorp/vagrant-installers. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about Ruby gems. So if you're unfamiliar with Ruby, the installable like unit is called a gem. So if you come from the Python world, you might be more familiar with a pip package or a wheel. But once you have this gem, you can go ahead and install it somewhere. So this is amazing if you're running like a web service where you have like a team of engineers that runs your infrastructure, and then you have like this gem artifact that you can plop on there and let things run as they will. That's a little bit of a simplification, of course, but when you're running a desktop application, then the responsibility of installing this gem is put on the user, and this can cause a little bit of problems. The first of which is which Ruby do you use and how do you install Ruby? So not all users will have Ruby installed or necessarily know what it is. So we don't want this to be a barrier for them to use Vagrant. On the other side of that, as a developer, we also want to be able to control the environment that Vagrant is running in, because if we're not able to do that, then we're susceptible to getting lots of bugs or issues about like Vagrant working in unexpected ways, because it was using the place that it's installed into is using like a strange version of Ruby, or maybe some like strange configuration that Vagrant really wasn't designed to be in. So the question is, how do I get a Ruby application that can be easily installable for the user, but also run consistently across many different types of machines, and also maybe many different platforms? So the answer for Vagrant is to build an installer that has the Ruby runtime already embedded into it. So in order to do this, and on Vagrant, we actually run a CI that is powered by Vagrant. So we use Vagrant to build Vagrant, if that's not confusing enough, or if you haven't heard the word Vagrant enough in this past 5 minutes. Okay, first thing we need to do is take a look at a few Vagrant concepts for those who are unfamiliar with it. So the way that you configure your environment is using this Vagrant file. This is actually a Ruby file that you can use to define the things that you want your virtual machine to have. So the most important thing in this file is defining the box. So the box is basically like the type of virtual machine that you want. And then the other concepts that we need to go over is provisioner. So in your configuration, you can define a provisioner. And this is like a configuration of an action that can run against your virtual machine. So in this example here, we have a box that brings up, that is Ubuntu, and we have a provisioner, which is something we can run against this box, and it'll run like a shell script that says hello or hi. Okay, so now that we've gone over those things and we're kind of on the same page, we can go ahead and try to build Vagrant. So the first thing that we do in order to make that happen is we need to have a way to do reproducible builds. This isn't really a new concept, but we use Packer to generate some Vagrant boxes. If you're unfamiliar with Packer, it's a tool that allows you to generate machines, images. So we go ahead and we bring up some virtual machines, we install our build tools in them, and then we use a post processor to generate a Vagrant box. And then once we do that, we can start building out our Vagrant configuration for how we want to go about building these installers. So the first part of that is to define which box we want to use. So that'll be one of the boxes that we installed our build tools into. And the next part of that is to define a provisioner. So this is the action that's going to run against this virtual machine that's actually going to do the build step. So what does that build step look like? So it's broken up into a couple of different steps. The first step is building the substrate. So this is where this is like an internal nomenclature for the stuff that needs to be installed for Vagrant to run. So this includes like the Ruby runtime, etc. The next piece that we need to build is the actual Vagrant. So this is the Vagrant gem that needs to be installed. And in addition to that, it'll go ahead and install that gem into the substrate. So we get all of Vagrant's dependencies. And the last bit of this process is to generate an installable package. So that's going to be a different step for each different platform that we're going to build installers for. But at the end, we'll come out with a similar looking package. So using Vagrant, we can go ahead and run this provisioning step against our box that has all of our build tools in it, and it'll go ahead and should pop out the same type of installer pretty much every time. So these are all of the platforms that we build for. If we have a more complicated Vagrant file than the one I showed before, we can see that we can build a bunch of different installers for each different platform that we need. And then if we take a look inside the package, we can see that we have this Vagrant executable along with this embedded directory that has the Ruby runtime and all the different dependencies that Vagrant needs in order to run. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to build a Vagrant package. If I can share my other screen, here we go. So, nice. So we have this Vagrant file that defines our build. We have this box that we want to use that has all of our build tools already installed on it. And then we have these provisioning steps that do the building of the substrate. So that's all of the dependencies that Vagrant needs to run, including the Ruby runtime. And then we have this packaging step that does the actual building of Vagrant and installing it as a gem. So I've gone ahead and run the substrate step already because it will take a pretty long time to run. It's just running a bunch of builds. But we can go ahead and run this packaging provisioning step. And so this step will, this step will do the last 2 bits of that packaging where we go ahead and generate the Ruby gem. And then we go ahead and install that Ruby gem. So we get all of Vagrant's dependencies. And then we go ahead and package everything up together. So in this case, we're running against Ubuntu. So we should expect to get a deb package out. So if we scroll up a little bit in our logs, we can see that we've built this Ruby gem that is Vagrant. And we can see in a second that it is going to go install that gem, and it's installing all of its dependencies. And then at the end of this, we output a little message saying that we've created our deb package, and we can take a look at it here. So now we could install this deb. So that was just a short little demo. All right. So we have lots of love for Ruby on the Vagrant team, even though it does present some challenges for distribution. We are able to overcome those by adding this layer of installation so that Vagrant is always running in this environment that we can control. And ultimately, that allows the user to have a better experience and us as developers to have a better experience answering issues. If you're on GitHub, you can come give us some love at HashiCorp Vagrant. And if you're interested in our installers and how they work, you can take a look at HashiCorp Vagrant-installers. Thanks, that's all I had for you today. I hope you learned a little bit about packaging Ruby as a desktop application. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you so much. Yeah, well, actually, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. There you go. So how big is the Vagrant team at HashiCorp, actually?
We're pretty small. There's 2 of us that work primarily on Vagrant.
Mhm. And what are outside the contributions you're looking for?
So we have a guide up on GitHub of what kind of contributions we like, but also in our issues, we try to do a pretty good job of labeling everything up. So we have lots of stuff labeled good first issue. But also Vagrant has a lot of different providers that it uses. So we have, if you're like interested in like some operating systems for Vagrant to support or some provisioners for Vagrant to support, we usually tag up issues with those as well. So if you happen to be interested in those things, you can take a look at our issues and see if any of them are popping around.
Awesome. One thing our audience is wondering is like, what is the most sought after feature request that alas won't make it into upstream Vagrant?
I don't know. I feel like there's lots of feature requests that are requested, but maybe won't make it.
Maybe one that stands out to you in particular?
At least like how things stand now, we have some like requests about like remote execution and stuff, which I think would be super cool. But I don't think we're like really in the position to like take on that kind of work just yet.
Thank you. So does Vagrant have any community channels that folks can come in and participate in, like a forum or Slack, Discord, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so we have this service called HashiCorp Discuss, which you can use to interact with the community. But also we're on GitHub, so if you have like issues or want to talk or something, we'll be there too.
Cool, thank you. So then our next question is, thank you very much for that link. Are there any features that you've shipped with a partner or customer?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there might be some, but again, I'm pretty new to this team. So, yeah.
Cool. So the HashiCorp user groups, or as I just learned that they're called hugs, I'm dying. I love this so much. Sorry. Did they make the move online? Have a lot of them been taking place online?
Yeah. I actually don't know the answer to the question. This question, when I did more DevOps work, I remember going to a bunch of them. But I thought they were mostly community organized. I'm not quite sure what the situation is there. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. I think that's the last question I see. I don't think I'm missing any. So I will say, folks, thank you so much for these questions. Sophia, thank you so much for this enlightening talk, for being both on the panel and here. Like, we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well,
yes. So this is the end of our contributing today Ruby session. But we will be back pretty soon on April 7th with an edition about game development.
Fun.
Yeah. So if you have any other questions, we are not back on April 7th about game development. Scratch that. We will have sorry, what was that? No, other I know. Okay.
I'm just getting this in that we were
This was not what I was supposed to say. Okay, skip that. But we will be back very soon. Can check the calendar on our website.
I think we're a go for our next topic, right? About Go.
Oh, yeah. So on April 7th, it's about open source funding sponsoring. Well, there you go. yeah, it's a bit late. It's your fault, Ramon. It's your birthday, so I was like totally focused on that. But we should definitely join the next session too. Thank you everyone for joining for this talk. And well, we'll hope to hear from you in Discord if you have any questions for either the panelists or about the talk from Sophia, and we'll be there as well.
Enjoy the rest of your day or evening, everybody. Take care and stay tuned.